In the historic town of Nantucket Sound, where waves crash against sun-faded docks and locals sip espresso in centuries-old cafes, the Calloway estate stood as both a landmark and a mystery. Perched on a cliffside overlooking the Atlantic, the Calloway home wasn't just beautiful, it was iconic. A restored colonial manor with sailcloth curtains and hand-carved shutters, it was the type of place that ended up in travel magazines and historical society brochures. It was also the home of Richard Calloway, a 46-year-old architect known for saving old structures from demolition and breathing life into them again. He was thoughtful, dignified, and guarded, traits that made him beloved by the town's elite and quietly feared by those who knew him more intimately. 5 years ago, Richard's wife, Mary Ann, passed away from pancreatic cancer. The town mourned her like royalty. She was the warm heart of every fundraiser, a patron of the arts, and the mother of Richard's only son, Elliot. Before we dive into this true crime drama, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you enjoy long-form stories like this one. Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts as the twists unfold. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story might just be darker than the last. Now, let's begin. This is the story of how a housewife's affair with her stepson turned a quiet coastal town into a crime scene. Elliot had been 17 when she died. Shy, brilliant, and already deeply interested in marine life, he began spending more time by the harbor than with people. He spoke more to the sea than to his classmates. The Calloways were broken, and everyone saw it, until Savannah arrived. Savannah Calloway was unlike anyone Nantucket had seen before. She was 34, with a painter's eye and a model's poise. Before moving to the coast, she'd worked in the New York art scene, running a boutique gallery in Brooklyn Heights and dabbling in portrait photography. Some say Richard met her at a historical architecture gala in Manhattan. Others whispered that she'd targeted him, that her arrival wasn't coincidence but calculation. Whatever the truth, she moved in just 18 months after Mary Ann's death. The town resisted her at first. Too polished. Too fast. Too out of place. But Savannah was savvy. She hosted brunches with antique china. She complimented the pastor's wife on her hymns. She volunteered to repaint the local museum's lobby. Eventually, they warmed to her. Even Elliot. Especially Elliot. By the time Savannah and Richard were married, barefoot on the beach, with white hydrangeas and a harpist flown in from Boston, Elliot had started smiling again. At least in public. He was in college now, studying marine biology at a university in New Hampshire, but he spent his summers at home, working at the marina and sleeping in the old guest house on the property. To the outside world, the Calloways had healed. They were a new version of perfect. A second chance at family. But if you walked by their mansion at the right time of night, maybe just after midnight, when the sea breeze pressed the windows and the moonlight turned the cliffs silver, you might see what the cameras didn't. A flicker of light in the guest house window. A silhouette moving in Savannah's studio. 2 glasses, not one, left out on the gallery counter. You might wonder who was awake. And why. Because something was stirring behind the polished veneer of the Calloway home. Something dangerous. Something forbidden. And it started, as most storms do, with silence. It started with a painting. Savannah had set up her easel in the converted barn behind the Calloway estate, a sun-bleached space filled with turpentine fumes, thrift store canvases, and faded jazz records that crackled from a vintage stereo. Richard rarely visited the barn. It was her space, as he often said with an absent smile while returning to his blueprints and meetings. But Elliot came often. At first it was casual. A nod through the open door. A silent agreement to share space while she painted, and he reviewed marine samples for a research assistantship he hoped to land. He'd spread out his tide charts and plankton logs at the old workbench. Savannah would set up her oil paints beside the wide window. There wasn't much talk, just the scratching of pencils, the scent of sea salt and turpentine, and two minds that didn't quite belong in the world outside. But it was in that silence that something else started forming. It wasn't attraction. Not at first. It was understanding. Elliot wasn't like the other young men in town. He didn't drink with the yacht club boys or flirt with the waitress at Bella Luna Cafe. He moved through life cautiously, with an unspoken grief still clinging to him. The death of his mother had changed him in ways he hadn't even begun to process. Savannah noticed. And for the first time since she'd married Richard, she didn't feel like a guest in her own life. There were moments, small ones but telling. One day, she paused by Elliot's sketchbook and commented on a detailed ink rendering of a jellyfish. He blushed. Another afternoon, she offered him a lemon scone she'd baked that morning. He hesitated, then took it, nodding in thanks. She smiled longer than she should have. And once, just once, he caught her staring at him as he adjusted the straps on the back of his marine pack. Her expression wasn't maternal. It wasn't friendly. It was something else. That night, he didn't sleep. Richard, for all his success, had grown more distant. The museum project downtown had taken over his life. He often worked late, returning home exhausted and barely present. Their dinners were quiet. His kisses were brief. Savannah, once vibrant and full of ideas, now sat alone in the candlelight, refilling her wine glass, waiting for someone who never really noticed her anymore. Except Elliot did. One night in late June, a thunderstorm rolled in off the coast. The barn lost power mid-evening, and Savannah lit oil lamps, their soft glow casting flickering shadows along the cedar walls. Elliot had arrived drenched from his shift at the marina, his hoodie clinging to him, eyes lit from the sea. "Storm's wild," he said, breathless. "You're soaked," Savannah replied. "Here." She pulled a blanket from a trunk and tossed it to him. He wrapped it around his shoulders and sat by the window, watching the lightning flash across the ocean. She poured wine, just one glass, and handed it to him. He took it. They didn't talk for a long while. Only the storm spoke for them. Then Savannah asked, quietly, "Do you ever think about before?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward her. The space between them felt alive. He saw it in her eyes then. The want. The storm outside cracked, and something inside Elliot cracked, too. But he stood, said nothing, and walked back to the guest house with the blanket still clutched in his hand. The next day, neither of them mentioned it. But the silence had changed, and something far more dangerous had begun to rise with the tide. There was a painting Savannah had kept hidden from Richard. It lived behind a tarp in the far corner of the barn, away from the canvases she displayed at town exhibits or charity galas. The portrait was raw, half-finished, layers of deep blue over skin tones that bled into stormy gray. The face in the painting didn't look like anyone Richard would know. But Elliot recognized himself the moment he saw it. He didn't ask. And she didn't explain. That's how the summer deepened, on unspoken truths that no one dared name. By mid-July, Richard's presence at home had become a ghostly thing. He'd accepted a temporary position as an adjunct professor in Boston, commuting 3 hours away 3 days a week. He called Savannah at night. She always answered. She always smiled. But she no longer listened. Elliot stayed behind to care for the estate, which needed repairs after the last coastal storm. Gutters, windows, the back fence. His room in the guest house became a sort of halfway point, close enough to the main house to feel involved, far enough to create a quiet sort of independence. Savannah started baking again. Not for Richard, but for Elliot. He'd wake to the smell of cinnamon and find a still warm croissant wrapped in cloth by the boathouse steps, or a thermos of black coffee waiting by his kayak. She never left a note, but he knew it was from her. He didn't stop her. One night, he returned late from a coastal dive study. The wind had picked up, and the stars were sharp as ice in the sky. He was salty, tired, and sunburned. Savannah was sitting on the back patio in a robe, reading Wuthering Heights by the glow of string lights. "You look like you've been through a war," she said softly, closing the book. "You should see the jellyfish out there tonight," he said. And then, before he could stop himself, he added, "Want to?" She raised an eyebrow. "No." "Why not?" "The moon's full. I've got the boat ready." They launched just past 11 p.m. The ocean was calm. The moonlight turned the waves to liquid silver. She sat beside him, her bare feet tucked under a blanket, sipping from a flask he offered. "Cognac." She winced. He grinned. They talked. Really talked. About Marianne. About Savannah's old gallery. About how Richard used to be different, more alive. When Elliot pulled the boat to a drifting stop, he dropped the dive lights into the water. A pale blue glow filled the sea beneath them. Then came the jellyfish. Dozens of them, lighting up like tiny constellations. Savannah gasped. He didn't look at the jellyfish. He was looking at her. And she was looking back. The kiss happened before either of them realized it. A slow, burning thing. Her hand on his shoulder. His breath hitching. There was no storm this time. No excuses. No whine. Only silence. Only want. Only the heat of a moment neither of them could undo. When they returned to shore, they didn't speak. She didn't say good night. He didn't go back to the guest house. He followed her inside. The next morning, Elliot stood alone on the back porch, staring out at the sea. He felt like the dock after a storm, still upright, but something beneath him had shifted. Savannah came up behind him, slipped her hand around his waist, and whispered, "Don't regret this." But even as she said it, her eyes looked scared. And Elliot already did. Routine is a funny thing. Even the most dangerous habits can start to feel normal when repeated enough times. And that's exactly what happened in the Calloway house. By August, the affair between Savannah and Elliot had become a rhythm, quiet, deliberate, and deeply buried beneath the layers of their perfect suburban performance. Theirs was a love carved out of the in-between hours. A love made of soft knocks on the barn door and footsteps on creaking hallway floorboards. A love that pretended not to exist in the daylight, but lived fully in shadows. And yet, for all the stolen kisses and whispered promises, neither could shake the feeling that the clock was ticking. Richard's presence, however infrequent, still hung over the estate like salt in the air. He'd come home from Boston on Thursdays, stay through Sunday, and then leave again. Savannah played the devoted wife to perfection. Fresh flowers in the foyer, handmade pasta on the stove, and perfectly timed kisses that didn't linger. Elliot played the good son, polite, distracted, helpful. But Richard noticed the shifts. A book left on the wrong side of the counter. A scarf Savannah never used to wear. Elliot avoiding eye contact when asked about his studies. "What's going on with you two?" he asked once, midway through a family dinner of grilled swordfish and roes. Savannah smiled too quickly. Elliot coughed and said, "Nothing." Richard didn't press it. But that night, he stayed up late in the study, just sitting, watching the tide roll in through the window. The affair deepened, not just in body, but in complexity. Savannah began leaving small gifts in Elliot's room, a painting, a pressed flower, a handwritten page from a poem she'd once recited in college. Elliot, in turn, began writing her coded messages in his dive journal. Phrases only she would understand. He drew her lips from memory, her hands, the curve of her back. He convinced himself it was love. But he was also starting to fray. It was Elliot who suggested they end it. One early morning after Richard had returned to Boston, Elliot stood by the barn window, pale and sleep-deprived, and said, "We have to stop." Savannah didn't speak. He continued, "I'm not built for this. I think about him every time. I think about my mom." Her eyes didn't soften. They darkened. "So that's it?" she asked. "You're done?" "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it. For 2 weeks, they kept their distance. Savannah returned to painting. Elliot retreated to the harbor. Richard remained oblivious, at least on the surface. But then came the slip. Savannah's birthday. Richard hosted a dinner. Invited a few close friends and colleagues. Savannah wore a pale green silk dress. Elliot arrived late, hair still damp from diving. During dessert, someone made a toast. Richard kissed Savannah's cheek. And Elliot, visibly shaken, excused himself early, claiming a migraine. Savannah followed him out 20 minutes later. They didn't speak. But her hand found his in the dark. And just like that, they were back where they started. By the end of August, Savannah was pregnant. She didn't know it yet. But her body did. The dizziness, the fatigue, the sudden aversion to wine and seafood. She assumed it was stress. Until she took a test, alone, in the upstairs guest bathroom where she kept the things she didn't want Richard to find. 2 pink lines. Positive. She sat on the cold tile for over an hour, holding the test in both hands like it might rewrite itself. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared. Because somewhere in her gut, beneath the nausea and shame, she already knew who the father was. Savannah had always been good at pretending. In New York, she'd built an entire career on it, curating galleries, charming wealthy collectors, weaving her own story into whatever the moment needed. She knew how to smile with her eyes and hide 1,000 truths behind her lips. Now, she would use every ounce of that skill. Because there was no world where she could tell the truth. She waited 3 days before taking action. On the 4th evening, just after Richard returned from Boston, Savannah greeted him with wine, candles, and her old perfume. The one he'd gifted her on their wedding night. They hadn't made love in over a month. But that night, she drew him in with practiced ease. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about evidence. She needed doubt. She needed a timestamp. She needed him to believe the child was his. Richard didn't question the sudden intimacy. If anything, he welcomed it. He'd been feeling distance between them for weeks and thought, naively, that maybe she'd just missed him. He whispered, "I've missed you." She replied, "I know." And she meant it, but not the way he thought. The next morning, Savannah made her announcement over breakfast. A plate of croissants, a bowl of blueberries, 2 cups of coffee, and a small white envelope with a pregnancy test inside, laid gently between the butter dish and Richard's hand. His reaction was everything she needed it to be. Shock, disbelief, tears, then joy. "You're serious?" he asked. She nodded slowly. His arms enveloped her, and she pretended to melt. But inside, her heart twisted. Not with guilt, with fear. Because she knew it was only a matter of time before someone saw through the illusion. Elliot was the first to crack. She waited a week before telling him. Met him in the barn after one of his dives. "I'm pregnant," she said, arms folded, face unreadable. He looked at her like she'd dropped a grenade at his feet. He didn't speak. She said nothing else. Finally, he whispered, "Is it mine?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "Richard thinks it's his." Elliot's knees buckled slightly as he leaned back against the workbench. "You need to end this. Tell him the truth. This isn't something we can lie about." But Savannah only stared at him. Then, quietly, "I'm not losing everything." Over the next few weeks, the performance began. Savannah became the glowing, expectant wife, hosting small brunches, updating Richard on nursery ideas, blaming her quiet moods on morning sickness. Richard doted on her, took time off, started painting the upstairs guest room in soft gray blue. And Elliot, he unraveled. He skipped marine lab hours, avoided meals, drank too much coffee, slept too little. Sometimes, Savannah would find him sitting on the back porch at 3 a.m., staring out at the sea, looking like a man twice his age. And once, when Richard wasn't home, he asked her, "Are you scared?" She looked down at her stomach, then at him, and said, "Not yet." But something was changing. Richard had started noticing small things. A doctor's card left out with no name. 2 sets of footprints by the cliff trail behind the house. A flicker of something in Elliot's eyes during dinner. He never said anything. But one night, as he stood at the sink washing dishes, he looked out at the barn and asked himself the question he'd been avoiding for weeks. Why does this not feel right? Richard Calloway had always trusted his instincts. As an architect, he could walk into a crumbling structure and know exactly where the weak points were, what would fall first, what could be salvaged. He knew how to read tension in beams, cracks in ceilings, the sound of stress beneath wood. Now, he was starting to feel it in his own home. A tension he couldn't explain. It wasn't one thing. It was everything. Savannah had become careful. Too careful. She used to hum while she cleaned. Now, she played music loud enough to drown out everything. She used to share every detail of her day. Now, she edited. She curated. She deflected with charm. And Elliot, he was barely recognizable. The boy who once measured plankton with obsessive precision now left half-finished logs on the kitchen counter. His marine charts had curled from ocean damp, untouched for weeks. He came home late, slept in longer, and when he looked at Richard, it was like he was looking through him. Richard didn't want to believe it. But something was very, very wrong. Savannah knew it, too, and it terrified her. Because Richard, in his quiet, methodical way, had started asking questions. Small ones. Gentle ones. What week are you in again? Remind me, who was the doctor you saw last week? Funny, I thought we used a different paint color last time in that room. None of the questions were accusatory. But Savannah felt the noose tightening. And the one person she might have relied on, Elliot, had begun to withdraw. The baby, meanwhile, was growing. So was the risk. Savannah had done everything she could to preserve the lie. She faked forgetfulness when Richard mentioned prenatal appointments. She staged photos of her and Richard shopping for cribs. She even began journaling in a visible leather notebook by the bed, entries that painted their relationship in glowing colors, just in case anyone ever read them. She thought of everything, except how far she was willing to go. The turning point came on a cold morning in late September. Richard, unshaven and unusually quiet, sat at the kitchen table holding a piece of paper. A test order. From the lab Savannah had used early in her pregnancy. "You forgot this in the study," he said. She froze. "Oh," she said. "That was from the first round of blood work. Nothing important." Richard didn't speak for a long moment. Then he folded the paper and slid it back across the table. "You're a beautiful liar," he said quietly, and walked out the front door. That night, Savannah didn't sleep. She lay in bed beside the man she once seduced into a marriage of convenience, now a threat to everything she'd built. She watched the moonlight slip through the curtains, listened to the house breathe, and realized she only had two options: confess or erase the problem. The idea came quietly, not as a plan, as a possibility. If Richard were gone, the questions would be, too. He'd already updated his will after their wedding. Everything, the estate, the insurance, the properties, would go to her. The baby, she told herself, would grow up safe. The lie would never be discovered. The town would mourn a respected man lost too soon. And she would survive. She always did. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed help. So she returned to the only person who had as much to lose as she did: Elliot. She waited until a storm hit the coast, loud wind, roaring tide, the kind of night that masked dark intentions. She found him in the barn, staring at the boat journal he hadn't touched in weeks. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I know what you're going to say," he replied, eyes still on the page. "No," she said. "You don't." And then, slowly, she told him the plan. A slow-acting poison, made from a native sea plant. Hard to trace. Mimics cardiac fatigue. "Think of it as a natural death," she whispered. Elliot went white. "Jesus, Savannah, he's my father." "He'll find out," she said, voice breaking. "And then what? You think we'll just be forgiven? You think you'll have a future? A career?" He shook his head. "This isn't love," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's survival." And after a long silence, Elliot, broken, exhausted, terrified, finally whispered, "Okay. Poison is not like what people see in movies. It doesn't always kill with a gasp or a final dramatic clutch of the chest. The poison Savannah had chosen worked quietly, like time or regret, slow and patient. She had found it through one of her art connections in Provincetown, a woman who dabbled in coastal remedies. A sea botanist with no moral compass and a deep understanding of what wouldn't show up in standard talk screens. The compound came from a rare plant that grew along the salt marshes, a low-dose neurotoxin that, over time, would mimic heart failure and exhaustion. In small doses, it looked like nothing more than stress and age. Perfect. The first dose went into Richard's nightly tea. He always had chamomile with honey after dinner. Savannah made it for him every night that week. The first few days, there was nothing. No symptoms. No questions. By the fourth night, he complained of a headache. By the seventh, he said he'd been waking with muscle aches and a strange tightness in his chest. "It's probably the stress," Savannah murmured, brushing her hand across his forehead. "You've been working too much." He nodded. He trusted her. Of course he did. Elliot, however, couldn't sleep. He stayed in the guest house almost full-time now, avoiding the main house except when absolutely necessary. Every creak in the floorboards made him flinch. Every cough from his father set off a chain reaction of panic. When Savannah told him it had started, that the doses were working, he turned pale. "I didn't ask you to actually do it," he said. "You didn't stop me," she replied, too calm. It wasn't just the guilt that was eating Elliot alive, it was the weight. Watching his father deteriorate wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. Richard grew fatigued. His hands trembled slightly over breakfast. He lost weight. He started canceling meetings and sleeping more. At first, the doctors weren't concerned. "Could be viral," one said. "Maybe just burnout." Savannah made sure to mention his recent workload in front of them. "He's been pushing himself," she told them. "And with the baby on the way, he's been trying to do everything." She even handed Richard vitamins, which, of course, masked the real damage happening underneath. But then came the scare. One night, Richard collapsed in the hallway. He didn't fall unconscious, just dropped to his knees, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. Savannah rushed to him and played the perfect role. "Oh my God, Richard!" she cried, already dialing 911. "It's okay, sweetheart, I've got you. Just stay with me, please." The ambulance arrived in minutes. And just like that, he was taken to the hospital. Savannah rode in the front seat. Elliot stood on the porch, frozen, watching the tail lights disappear down the cliffside road. At Nantucket General, doctors ran tests. Blood work, EKG, neurological scans. Everything pointed to stress-induced arrhythmia. They prescribed medication, ordered rest. No one asked about plant-based neurotoxins. Richard came home 4 days later, weaker, but alive. And suddenly, Savannah realized this might not be enough. That night, she visited Elliot. She found him sitting in the barn, his face gaunt, eyes red. "You have to stop this," he said. Savannah walked to the workbench, where one of his journals lay open. She closed it. "He's getting stronger," she said. "They gave him medication." "Good," Elliot snapped. "Then maybe we can end this before it goes any further." But she only looked at him. The softness was gone. "Do you really think we'll get another chance to walk away clean?" He stared at her in silence. And somewhere deep in that silence, a part of him broke for good. The next morning, Savannah doubled the dose. Just once. But it was enough. That night, Richard took 2 sips of his tea and stopped. "This tastes off," he muttered. Savannah's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" she asked, reaching for the cup. He handed it to her, brow furrowed. "It's bitter. You used the wrong honey." She forced a laugh, too high-pitched. "Oh, maybe I grabbed the raw jar. I'll fix it." But in her chest, panic bloomed. She had gone too far. She had made a mistake. And now there might not be time to fix anything. 4 years, Richard Calloway had built homes to last forever. He restored churches that had lost their steeples, stitched together mansions that had been chewed apart by storms. He believed in structure, in order, in the strength of foundations. But now, sitting alone in his study with a cold cup of tea beside him, he realized something terrible. His house, the one he'd built with his own hands, was falling apart. And not because of rot. Because of betrayal. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, Richard sat at his desk, going over every odd moment from the past 2 months. Savannah's shifts in mood. Elliot's distant eyes. The strange taste of his tea. The lingering looks he thought he'd imagined. They no longer felt like isolated shadows. They looked like fingerprints. He didn't want to believe it. He needed proof. By morning, he had a plan. He waited until Savannah left for a prenatal appointment, one she claimed was in town, though she'd refused to let him come. Then he called the clinic. They had no record of her. That was all it took. Richard began searching the house. Not violently. Not even angrily. Methodically. Like an architect examining a crumbling frame. In Savannah's vanity drawer, beneath designer scarves and perfume bottles, he found a vial. No label. Pale liquid. Sealed. In the barn, inside Elliot's dive locker, tucked under marine blueprints, he found a folded note in Savannah's handwriting. "If this works, we don't just get away. We start over." The next few hours were a blur. Richard didn't confront either of them immediately. He called a lawyer. Then he called someone else, Detective Isla Marin, a woman he'd helped redesign the roof of the island courthouse with. "Something's wrong in my home," he told her. "I don't want this to become a crime scene." But if I'm right, it already is. Marin told him to stay calm, to say nothing. She'd be there the next morning with a quiet team. Richard agreed. But by nightfall, something inside him broke. He couldn't wait. It was around 9 p.m. when Savannah brought him tea again. This time, she smiled too tightly. Her hand trembled slightly. Richard didn't lift the cup. Instead, he looked up at her and said, "You don't have to keep pretending." "I know." For the first time in their marriage, Savannah didn't try to lie. She just stared at him. And that silence, that 5 seconds of silence, felt like an earthquake. "Was it always about him?" Richard asked. "Or was I just convenient?" Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You were kind." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to him. And the cruelest. Richard stood. Savannah panicked. He turned toward the door. She reached for something, anything, to stop him. Her fingers found the marble paperweight on his desk. She didn't think. She swung. The sound of impact was dull but final. Richard collapsed to the floor, a sharp gasp escaping his lips before silence took over. Savannah froze, still holding the bloodied paperweight in her hand. The room went quiet. Unmoving. Unreal. Then, footsteps. Fast. Heavy. It was Elliot, barreling down the hallway, his eyes wide with horror. He stopped in the doorway. He saw the body. He saw the blood. He saw her. And he whispered the same words she'd said weeks ago. "What have you done?" Savannah dropped the paperweight. It hit the rug with a muffled thud. "We have to make it look like an accident," she said breathlessly. "The stairs, he could have fallen." Elliot shook his head. "This wasn't the plan." "There was no plan," Savannah snapped. "There's only now. Help me." And in that moment, Elliot, sweating, panicked, sick with grief, stepped over his father's body and began to stage the scene. They moved Richard to the stairwell. They scattered books, pushed over a lamp, wiped down the teacup. Savannah tore at her blouse and rubbed her mascara. Then, just before midnight, she dialed 911. "Please," she sobbed into the phone. "My husband, he fell down the stairs. He's not breathing. Please, please send someone." Her voice cracked perfectly. She was, after all, a practiced performer. And outside, the ocean rose against the cliffs like it had been waiting for this all along. Detective Isla Marin had been to the Calloway house before. Not for work. For wine. 2 years ago, Richard had hosted a fundraiser for the Nantucket Historical Trust. She remembered the scent of burning cedar, the silver tray of cranberry brie crostini, Savannah's painted smile, and the way Elliot hovered on the edge of every room. That night, everything had looked perfect. Now, it looked like a crime scene. She arrived just before dawn. The house was shrouded in mist. Red and blue lights pulsed across the manicured lawn. Yellow tape danced lazily in the sea breeze. Inside, paramedics were covering Richard's body. At the foot of the stairs. Exactly where Savannah had said he'd fallen. Marin took her time. She walked the perimeter first. The stairwell was wide, curved, with polished wood and brass handrails. No loose boards. No blood spatter on the risers, just around Richard's head. She knelt down beside it. The blood pooled too cleanly. The position of the body felt arranged. She stood slowly. Already, her gut was whispering, "This isn't right." Savannah sat on the couch, wrapped in a robe, makeup streaked, hands trembling. Elliot stood silently behind her, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. Marin introduced herself and sat across from Savannah. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. "Thank you," Savannah whispered. "You said he fell?" "Yes," she replied, perfectly rehearsed. "He'd been dizzy all week. I tried to catch him." Marin nodded. "May I ask where you were when it happened?" "I was just bringing him tea. We were in the study." He stood up, turned toward the hallway, and he stumbled. "Was he holding the tea?" Savannah blinked. "No. I put it on the desk." Marin jotted a note. Then she turned to Elliot. "And you?" Elliot didn't meet her eyes. "I was upstairs. I heard her scream. Did you come down right away?" He hesitated. "Yes." Savannah's eyes flicked toward him. Just for a second. But Marin caught it. The autopsy was ordered immediately. Toxicology samples were taken. So were fingerprints on the cup, the stair rail, the paperweight Marin found slightly out of place on the office rug. She didn't say anything. Not yet. But she noticed everything. Over the next 48 hours, the Calloway home became a quiet theater of suspicion. Neighbors left flowers at the gate. Savannah held a press photo by the sea, weeping softly, thanking the community for their support. Elliot stayed indoors. The investigation stayed quiet. But Marin was working. She pulled phone records, clinic records, prescription refills. She returned to the house under a second warrant. In Savannah's locked vanity drawer, she found the unlabeled vial. In Elliot's dive journal, she found a folded note with smudged ink. Not a confession, but a plan. A trace of something that had almost been erased. Then came the breakthrough. Richard's smartwatch. A model designed to track heart rate, location, sleep cycles. Marin's team uploaded the logs. What they found was chilling. At 8:53 p.m., Richard's heart rate spiked into full cardiac distress. At 8:56 p.m., it dropped sharply, flatlined. At 9:07 p.m., Savannah called 911. 11 minutes later. It wasn't enough to arrest, but it was enough to press. Marin returned to the estate. She asked to speak with Elliot. Alone. They sat on the back porch, where the waves struck the rocks below like a ticking clock. "You know," she said gently, "your father called me the day before he died." Elliot looked up, startled. He said something felt off. Said he didn't want it to become a crime scene. But he was afraid it already was. Elliot didn't answer. She let the silence stretch. "You don't have to protect anyone anymore," she said softly. "You just have to tell the truth." For a long time, Elliot said nothing. Then his lips parted, and his voice broke. "She didn't mean to," he said. "That night wasn't supposed to happen that way." Confessions don't always come with tears. Sometimes they come in pieces, broken, quiet, offered like stones dropped into deep water, each one vanishing beneath the surface until the ripples reach shore. That's how it happened with Elliot. It took 3 hours. Detective Marin sat with him in the sunroom of the Calloway estate, surrounded by the smell of salt air and old paint. Savannah was in town, giving another soft-spoken interview about Richard's tragic fall. Elliot's hands trembled as he spoke. About the affair, the pregnancy, the lies, and finally, the plan, the poisoning, the panic, the paperweight. Every word cut through the air like a cold wind. By the time he finished, Marin's recorder was full. So was her heart. She had solved cases before, dozens. But none had ever felt this, personal. Because it wasn't just a story of murder. It was a story of manipulation, of grief, of a boy who'd lost his mother and then been led by the wrong hand into the darkest kind of love. Savannah was arrested just after sunset. She had just stepped out of the local market with a bag of apples and a bottle of prenatal vitamins. Marin approached her quietly. "Savannah Calloway," she said. "You're under arrest for the murder of Richard Calloway." Savannah blinked, laughed, like it was a bad joke. Then she saw Elliot behind Marin, head down, hands in his pockets, face pale. And she knew. He had talked. The smile fell from her lips. The mask shattered, and she whispered, "You stupid boy." The island exploded with whispers. By nightfall, every house on the coast had heard the news. The perfect couple. The son. The affair. The baby. The murder. The betrayal. It spread like wildfire, through cafes, through bookstores, through dinner tables where once idolizing neighbors now shook their heads and asked how no one had seen it coming. Elliot was placed under protective custody while formal charges were prepared. His confession was clear, painful, devastating, but it also showed cooperation and remorse. The DA's office had no choice but to recommend a lesser charge: conspiracy to commit murder, accessory after the fact. Savannah, however, would face the full weight of the law. The evidence was airtight. The toxicology report revealed consistent, measurable doses of poison over 21 days. The smartwatch logs aligned with Elliot's confession. The note in Savannah's handwriting, found in Elliot's dive journal, painted a chilling picture of intent. The staged scene, Richard's body too neatly placed, the delayed 911 call, told the rest. The arraignment took place behind closed doors. Savannah appeared in a gray sweater dress, her belly now noticeably showing. She didn't look at Elliot. Elliot didn't speak. When asked for her plea, Savannah raised her chin and said, "Not guilty." But no one believed her. Not anymore. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted. Cameras flashed. A local podcast host stood beneath a Calloway House backdrop and whispered into her mic. "This is the story that's changing how we look at love, lies, and legacy in the Northeast Coast." And behind it all, the house sat still. The nursery Richard had half-painted now silent. The teacups still stacked in the dishwasher. The portrait Savannah once painted of Elliot now stored away as evidence. And Marin. She drove home that night in silence. Another case solved. Another life ruined. But this one, she knew, would follow her. Because not even the strongest houses can stand when the people inside are building something broken. By the time Savannah Calloway stood trial, the nation already knew her name. Cable news anchors ran polished segments titled "The Nantucket Heiress and the Son She Seduced." Podcasts dissected her every move, her posture at press conferences, the curve of her smile in wedding photos, her carefully curated Instagram aesthetic that had since gone dark. True crime forums lit up with theories, timelines, and arguments about guilt, power, and manipulation. But inside the courtroom, there was only silence, and the weight of everything she'd built now crashing down on her. The trial began in early spring, 6 months after Richard's death. Savannah entered the courtroom each morning in a muted gray suit, her now pronounced pregnancy bump wrapped neatly beneath tailored fabric. Her attorneys leaned heavily into image. They painted her as a grieving, isolated woman, pushed beyond her limits by a powerful, neglectful husband and a troubled stepson with unresolved trauma. They used words like unhinged, coerced, and trapped. But the prosecution had something stronger than narrative. They had evidence. Week 1 of the trial was clinical. The toxicologist explained the rare marine neurotoxin found in Richard's system, dose by dose. A digital forensics analyst broke down the smartwatch logs, showing the exact minute Richard's vitals flatlined, and how it happened long before Savannah called 911. The crime scene technician pointed to inconsistencies between where Richard's body was found and the supposed fall. Then came the note, handwritten by Savannah, retrieved from Elliot's journal. Even in court, reading it made the room go still. If this works, we don't just get away. We start over. Week 2 was emotional. Neighbors, friends, and gallery clients testified to Savannah's charm, but also noted how quickly her personality changed after marrying Richard. One even mentioned seeing Savannah and Elliot together at a beach cove, weeks before the affair supposedly began. Then came the surprise witness. Dr. Simone Reynolds, Savannah's former therapist from Brooklyn, who had been subpoenaed after records showed a history of boundary testing and romantic delusion in Savannah's past relationships. She believed love should be all-consuming, Reynolds testified. And when it wasn't, she often became reckless. Savannah sat still during the testimony, lips tight, hands folded. Only once did she glance toward Elliot. And he didn't look back. Week 3 was Elliot's turn. He testified under a deal, reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation. He entered the courtroom in a pale blue shirt and black tie, eyes sunken, voice shaking. He spoke for nearly 4 hours. He told the jury everything, from the first kiss to the final lie. He didn't spare himself. He called it the worst mistake of my life. When asked if Savannah had pressured him to keep the pregnancy a secret, he said, "She said if the truth came out, I'd lose everything. That I'd go to prison. That the baby would be taken." And then, the final question. "Did you love her?" A pause. A swallow. Then, "I thought I did. But love doesn't destroy people like this." The defense tried to rattle him. Tried to pin the planning on him. Tried to call him emotionally unstable. But Elliot held his ground. And the jury believed him. Closing arguments came on a Monday. The DA's team called Savannah methodical, cold, and fully in control. Her lawyers argued she was misled, isolated, and emotionally manipulated. But in the end, the facts spoke louder than spin. The jury deliberated for just 2 days. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Richard Calloway, we find the defendant, Savannah Calloway, guilty. There was no gasp, no cry. Savannah simply closed her eyes, as if she had known all along that this was how it would end. The courtroom was packed. Not with press, not anymore, but with people. People who had once sat at the Callaways' dinner table. People who had donated to Savannah's art fundraisers. Former neighbors, former clients, old friends who had driven in from as far as Boston and Providence, just to witness the end. Because this wasn't just a sentencing. It was a reckoning. Savannah Calloway stood before the judge in a pale beige jumpsuit. Her pregnancy was unmistakable now. 7 months in, her hands resting on her stomach as if it were a shield. But nothing could shield her from the weight of what was coming. Judge Mara Leland was known for her calmness and clarity. But this morning, her voice carried something colder. Finality. "You orchestrated the slow, calculated murder of your husband," the judge began. "You involved a grieving young man in a twisted relationship that led not only to a child conceived in deception, but to a father taken from this world under the pretense of love. This court does not view you as naive. It views you as dangerous." Savannah didn't blink. For the crime of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For conspiracy to commit murder, and for criminal solicitation of a co-defendant, those charges will run consecutively. There was no sound in the room. Not even a gasp. Just the quiet sound of pen on paper as the clerk recorded the ruling. Savannah was led away in cuffs. She did not cry. She did not look back. 2 weeks later, in a secure medical unit at a state correctional facility, Savannah gave birth to a baby girl. The child was healthy. Unaware. Unasked for. Per court order, she was placed with a vetted adoptive family, one who would raise her away from the headlines, from the whispers, from the burden of her mother's sins. Her name was changed. No photos were published. Only Detective Isla Marin and the family attorney knew where she'd gone. As for Elliot, he stood beside his court-appointed attorney when his sentence was read. Because of his full confession, his cooperation, and his age at the time of the crime, the court offered him a plea deal. Greater than 25 years to life, with eligibility for parole after 15. The judge acknowledged his remorse. Acknowledged that he had been manipulated. But also reminded the court. Complicity is not absolution. Elliot nodded. He accepted it. Maybe even welcomed it. A year passed. Then another. The Calloway estate was sold, bought by a tech couple from New York who had no idea what had happened there. They tore down the nursery, painted over the barn studio, filled the home with new furniture and smiling children. They said it felt peaceful, as if the ghosts had finally moved on. Elliot kept to himself in prison. He read. He wrote. He studied psychology and marine ecosystems. He never tried to contact the adoptive family. Never asked where his daughter had gone. But in a small notebook, tucked in the spine of an old Herman Melville book, he had written her name once. A name no one else knew but him. And under it, a single sentence. I hope you never know who we were. Detective Marin was promoted to chief investigator for the island's Special Crimes Unit. She kept a photo of the Calloway house in her drawer, not to remember the crime, but to remind herself that even the most beautiful homes can be built on rotting foundations. She never forgot Elliot's voice that day on the porch. This wasn't love. No, it wasn't. It was need. It was trauma. It was a lie, spoken too long, believed too deeply, until it destroyed everything it touched. In the end, the story of the Calloways became more than a true crime case. It became a warning. About appearances. About silence. And about the dangerous stories we tell ourselves, when the truth is too painful to face.